And that being said, don't want to steal more time from Suresh. We can go with this awesome webinar on roles and policies. So thank you, folks.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar on roles and policies. Give me 1 second. So let's quickly look at how access control works. So there is access control is based on who is the user, right? The user has to be authenticated and his identity verified, and what operation is the user performing on what resource. Now, based on the privileges and the policies set in open metadata, the policy evaluator will say whether the operation is allowed on a given resource or not, right? So that is the access control in a nutshell. Open metadata implements fairly comprehensive access control. It supports both RBAC plus ABAC hybrid model. We are all about using metadata for performing automation and functions. Our roles and policies comprehensively use the metadata that is available. And so this hybrid model is built using policies, roles, and hierarchical teams. I'll explain how hierarchical teams plays into how we have built access control. Now, the fundamental construct for building roles and policies is rules, right? So they are the building blocks of access control. Now, a rule has a name so that you can identify what rule is doing what, and then a description of what the rule is trying to do, right? What kind of access control it is performing. It also has a list of resources for which this rule is applicable. It also has a list of operations that rule applies to. Now, there are some shortcuts here where you can define, you can say all for, a rule that applies to all the resources, all for the, operations where it applies to all the operations on resources. And then there is a condition. So there's an expression, spell-based expression, which can add further conditions on where the rule applies to. And then eventually rule resolves to either the access to for given list of resources and operations, whether the access is denied or allowed, right? So that's what a rule does. I talked about resources, right, that you can mention within a rule. We have, in open metadata, we have taken an approach of strongly typed API endpoints. So these API endpoints are resources, correspond to various entities, and you can see how rich open metadata is in terms of supporting all kinds of different entities and building relationship with them, between them as a metadata graph, right? So you can specify individual resources from this list, or a list of resources, are all, right, for all these resources if you want a rule to apply to it. Also, each resources have granular operations, right? So table now supports create, delete, view all, which is there for all the resources. But then table also has other operations like view queries, view tests, data profile. These are specific to a table. So every resource has a set of operations that is specific to it, right? And so you can mention those things in the rule so that you can control for specific resources and specific operations the access. Now, we also have conditions, right? So for conditions, we support policy functions. So here is the list of policy functions that we support. For example, no owner, right? If you mention no owner in the condition within a rule, it applies to all the resources that don't have ownership. If you say is owner, then it will see if the user who is accessing the resource is the owner of the resource. Either he is owner because he is part of the team that owns the resource, or he individually, as an individual, owns the resource. Now, match all tags. Match all tags is, it returns true if a resource has the tags, right? Resource must have the tags that are listed here, right? All the tags. It returns true, right? So, or a resource can match any of the tags, right? A resource has a tag that matches any of these tags. Then match any tag returns true. Match team is if a user and the resource belongs to the same team, then it will return true, right? So, so some of the examples of, using these policy functions in condition is you can build a rich expression language based conditions where you can combine all these policy functions, right? With and or. You can also do not owner, right? So a not operator is supported. So this is the way where you use the metadata and then use policy functions to use that metadata to build conditions, right? Rich conditions. I'll also show you as I give you more demos how these conditions are written and how these conditions apply. Okay. So some examples of rules, here is, organization policy, no owner rule, which says that allow any user to edit the ownership for all the resources when the resource does not have an owner, right? So this is a way where when you initially ingest metadata into open metadata, there are all these data assets that have no owner. You can crowdsource the owner information where anybody can go and say, hey, I think this person is the user owner, or this team is the owner, right? Similarly, what we want with open metadata is for everybody to discover and collaborate around the data. So we have, for owners, we allow all the, for all the resources, allow delete, edit all, and view all operations. That means, pretty much all the operations. If the user who is accessing that data asset is the owner, right? So these are, examples of rules. Next, we go to policies, right? Policies are a collection of rules. Okay, so here is an example where we have built organizational policy, and then we looked at this, organizational policy, no owner rule, right? If there is data asset doesn't have an owner, anybody can set the owner. If a person is the owner of an asset, he can do all the operations, right, on the resources that he owns. Those two rules are combined into an organizational policy, right? Now, specifically to policies, right? These policies can be assigned to teams, right? And anybody within that team is going to, have to, when he gets access control, these policies will, be evaluated. Now, users that belong to a team hierarchy inherit the team policy, right? I'll show you this in a demo, but as an example, we have attached organizational policy at the organization, right? Now, that organizational policy will be inherited by all the users in Division 1, Department 1, and Team 1 and Team 2, right? All users inherit the organizational policy. Now, a team wants to actually have team-specific policy. So let's say Division 1 added a policy here. That will be inherited by all the users in Division 1, Department 1, Team 1, and Team 2, right? You can also have a team-specific policy, right? This team has a specific policy. It only applies to the users within that team. Now, the reason why we want to do this is you don't want to attach policies or roles and build very complex rule mechanism per user, right? You want to actually have broad access allowed at the organizational level that is inherited by everybody, okay? Now let's look at roles, right? So policies is one way of doing the access control. Roles is another way of doing the access control. A role is, represents a job function, right? You want to have a data engineer role and they need certain kind of access. You can actually build all the rules within that data engineer role, or a data consumer role, right? So everybody is a data consumer in an organization because organizations are data driven. You can have data engineer role, data consumer role, and you can, provide them certain access. So here is an example of a data consumer role. And then it is built using, the roles are built using policies. So it has a list of policies. Here, it has a data consumer policy that applies to a data consumer role. So policy is a list of rules, right? And a role is a list of policies. and policy being, again, list of rules, right? So eventually, all of these things boil down to a set of rules that will be executed for providing access control. Now, roles can be assigned to teams or users. Now, users that belong to a team hierarchy inherit the roles from the parent teams. For example, what we ship open metadata with is organization has data consumer role assigned to it. That means every user within the organization always has a role called data consumer. Now, within, let's say, a marketing team, you can have a marketing team role that you can assign to, let's say, a marketing team division. That role will be inherited by all the users within that division, right? So now the reason why we do this again is you don't want to keep assigning for every user a role. Instead, you define it at certain hierarchy, and then all those roles will be inherited by the users that are within that hierarchy, right? So you always try to build roles that is reusable, right? Where users inherit these roles, and you don't have to actually define too many roles or individually assign them to the users. Now, we looked at what rules are, what policies are, and what roles are. How is policy evaluation work, right? So we saw a simple diagram at the beginning where who is the user, what operation is performing. Policy evaluator provides you whether the access is allowed or not. Now, if you deep dive into this, our policy evaluator works based on subject context, operation context, and resource context, right? So subject context defines who the user is and what role he has. And then he inherits all these policies, as we talked about, from teams that he belongs to. And so there are inherited policies. He also inherits roles from teams that, hierarchy that he belongs to. So subject context is who the user is, what roles and policies that apply to him. Operation context is what is the resource, right? He is trying to edit a description in a table, then the resource is table, right? And then operation is edit description, right? What operation he is performing, that is the operation context. And then the resource context, right? So he is, a user is trying to edit, let's say, a description for a table. This would include what the table is, right? What is the fully qualified name of the table? What is the ID of the table? What tags does the table have, right? Does it have PII tags? Does it have tier 1, tier 2 tags? And then the other key metadata related to resources, who the owner of that resource is, right? So that becomes a resource context. Now, all this information, different contexts are used by policy evaluator. Now, policy evaluator takes all the roles and policies, compiles a list of rules, and then it executes all these rules until it comes to a result where either a policy says access is denied, right? So this is then the access is denied for a user, or a policy says this user can perform this operation, allow it, and then the permission would say the user is allowed to access, perform that operation on a resource. Or if no rule is allowing the user to perform the operation, then the operation is not allowed, right? So deny, allow, not allowed. Now, one of the things that frequently gets asked about is, hey, I made a change in the roles and policies, but it's not working, right? Now, one of the reasons why this could be is you saw that there is a chain of policies and chain of roles, and then there are all this resource context where other tags and ownership and all of that. We are taking all this information, right, and using in the policy evaluator to perform access control. And a lot of this information requires reading data from making a lot of database access and things like that. In order to make policy evaluation performant, what we do is we cache this information, right? So we cache the information where user belongs to this team hierarchy. A user has these roles, These roles have these policies, and these policies have these rules. All of these are cached, right? And they're cached for 3 minutes, right? So for a period of 3 minutes, any change that you're making will not be available, and then the cache gets refreshed, and then any policy change you made comes into play. Okay. We also have APIs, right? We are, as OpenMetadata, we are super focused on APIs. Everything that we do, from UI and ingestion, everything is driven through APIs. We have 3 APIs related to access control, right? So there's policies API, where you can create a policy, update a policy, delete a policy, those kind of stuff. There is roles API, where, again, you can create roles, using the policies that you've already created, update it. You can perform, various operations. Most importantly, and you'll see a demo of permission APIs, later in the webinar. This is where you can actually, for a user, get all the permission he has, all the permission he has for a specific resource like a table, or the permissions he has on an instance of a table, right? A specific table. All of those things are, you can actually evaluate and see what permission a user has through the access control mechanism. Now, finally, just recapping how policy evaluation works. We have, for a given user, computed a list of roles and policies, and from that we have computed a list of rules. First, we evaluate deny rules, right? So that is where you want to broadly allow access, and then specific to a user's role, or specific to a user's team, you want to add deny rules for restricting the access, right? So broadly allow the access, and then add restrictions at narrower scopes. So first, deny rules are evaluated, and if any rule says deny access, we deny the access, and then we evaluate allow rules. If any other rule allows the access for a user, now the operation is allowed. Finally, no rules matched for a given access, to a resource and performing an operation by a user, then this is, we do not allow the access, because no rules, is either no rule is allowing the access, right? So this is the final, not allowing the access. That would be the result, right? If no rules match. So let's go to now webinar demo, and what we are trying to, what we'll do here is, there are many questions that people have asked on how do I do access control, for this scenario, right? So we've compiled a list of scenarios, and if any scenario is missing, you can ask questions in our Slack. So let's start with the setup for the webinar, right? This sort of, in a nutshell, should show what a typical organization looks like, right? So there's an organization that has a marketing team, and within marketing team, there are sub-teams. One team, focusing on customer experience. The other team is focusing on marketing operations. And, there is an engineering team. Under engineering team, we have infrastructure team. And there is a data team under the infrastructure team. Also in engineering team, there is, application team that develops application for this organization. Now, within customer experience, we have users, Jim and Lisa, and we have, customer sessions, customer complaints, customer churn as tables, and, under this customer experience, team. So these tables are owned by customer experience. Under operations, we have Larry and Katie. They have tables related to, customer tickets, service uptime. So they own these two tables, right? And under data team, we have, Mandy as a user, and the data team owns DIM customer table. Under application, we have, Adam as a user, and then, he owns customer events table, right? So that's the setup. The first scenario that we are going to take a look at is how roles are inherited from the parents, right? Parent teams. So here in this case, we have in organization, the organization has a role data consumer attached to it. And because of this, all the users in the entire organization inherit the data consumer role. So let's take a look at this on OpenMetadata. So here is the user's page. Now, if you look at any user, all the users are going to be having data consumer as inherited role, right? So everybody gets this role because organization has this role. Moving on to the next scenario. In the scenario 2, in this case, we have a marketing team which has decided that the people within the marketing team umbrella need to have a different role, right? An additional role called data steward that gives them more permissions. So let's take a look at that. We have marketing team that we have set up for the demo. And the marketing team has a role associated with it called data steward. Now, if you go look at users within the marketing team, they not only have data consumer that is coming from the organization level role, they also are inheriting data steward role, which is now assigned to all the users under the marketing team hierarchy. Moving on to the next scenario, for this, for next set of demo, what we are going to do is we are going to use this API that I talked about earlier, API for getting permissions of a user. And so you can actually use this API call to debug why a user is getting an access allowed or denied. If you want to debug it, this is a great tool or an API call to make use of. So what this API call is doing is it is getting permissions for a given user on a particular resource, right? And then, finally, what we are doing is just, making the JSON formatted for readability. So we will use this command to demonstrate what permissions are, users getting based on what policies and roles. So in scenario 3, this is frequently asked scenario, in our Slack channels. I want to restrict the PI, any data that has PI, that is PI or has any other sensitive tags. I want the data to be restricted to only the owners of the data. Nobody else should be able to see this, right? So in order to do that, what we have done is in the marketing team, where they don't want access to the sensitive data to outside the marketing team, we have marketing team here, and marketing team has attached a policy. And that policy goes like this, right? For all the resources, right? And for all the operations, deny them if that resource has a tag PII sensitive, right? In this case, you can add any other tags that might indicate sensitive data for you, comma separated here. For any data that is sensitive or a data asset that has PII sensitive tag, if the person is not the owner, right? The user who is trying to access this data is not the owner, deny all the access, right? So that's the rule that we have added. So let's take a look at, going back here, because marketing team now has this policy, any data that has PII tag is accessible only to the owner, right? So in this example, we have this table, customer complaints. And customer complaint has this customer tax ID column, which is marked as PII sensitive. That means that only the owners of this table, right, the users that belong to customer experience team, only they can access this, right? That's the policy that we have written. So let's start with whether Jim has access to this, right? So the way we would do that is we will run the command that I talked about, and then we'll run it for Jim. Now, Jim has these permissions on this specific customer complaints table, right? So which is create is not allowed for Jim. Delete is allowed because, organizational, policy owner rule is coming into, giving access for delete operation. View all operation is provided by data steward policy. So the existing policies, right, outside the policy that we currently defined is allowing all the operations, right? And you can actually see when the operation is allowed, edit description is allowed because of this rule, data steward policy edit rule. And then, it is coming from, that rule is coming from this policy, data steward policy. And that policy is part of data steward rule, right? So, so that is the, access or the permissions that Jim is getting. Now let's take a look at whether Larry, who is not the owner, he should not have access to this. And so even though he is part of marketing team, right? So let's look at what permissions Larry has on this customer complaints table. So if you now look at what the permission output is, create is denied, right? Because of the rule that we just now said, deny sensitive data access. And it is coming from a policy, demo data, sensitive data to, deny sensitive data to non-owners, right? So delete is denied, view all is denied. All the operations are denied because of the policy where we are saying if the data has PII sensitive, non-owners cannot access it. And in this case, Larry is not an owner, even though he's part of marketing team, and all the operations are denied on the table. This is true for Mandy and Adam as well, because they are not the owners. Moving on to scenario number 4. This is also a frequently asked question in our Slack channels. A team decides that the data that they own is very sensitive. Only the users within the team should have access to it. No other team should have access to this, right? So to do that, they are attaching a policy which says if the user who is trying to access the data that belongs here, that belongs to this team, is being accessed by a user from some other team, deny all the operations on all the resources, right? So let's set this up and see how this works. So here we have customer experience team, and they want to add a policy and deny access to the data from outside the team. Okay, so going back to our scenario, now Jim and Lisa, they are within the team, they have access to it, and then anybody else who is outside customer experience should not have access to the data. So let's take a look at what happens for Larry, who is from outside the customer experience team. If you look at this permission, now Larry has all the operations are denied because of demo deny data outside the team policy that we attach to the customer experience team. And the deny is because of this rule, deny outside team, that we have defined within that policy. Let's also look at Mandy, who is from engineering team. What access does she have on this customer complaints table? If you look at it, Mandy, again, because of the same policy, that because Mandy is outside the team, all the operations are denied. Let's move to the next scenario. And, these scenarios, we don't have, support for it yet. This scenario here is allow visibility to PII data to only certain team members, right? So, there are certain teams like legal teams, and, there are data steward team, or, they require access to PII sensitive data. So the way you do that is you allow view all, right? On all the resources that have tags PII sensitive for users within this team 1 and team 2. Anybody who is outside the team, the effect is denied, right? So the access is denied. This policy function in Teams will be available in release 1.0 so that you will be able to write these kind of policies. Scenario 6, allow visibility to PI data only to certain roles, right? So previously we saw certain teams have access to PI sensitive data. This is a similar policy, except that, instead of in Teams, you have, if a user has any of these roles, he gets access to the data. If he doesn't have this role, then the access is denied. Okay, so that is the scenario number 6. Scenario number 7: deny access to PI data for certain roles. Right now, there is a data consumer role or a data viewer role. They should not have access to PI data. The best way to do that is in the data viewer or a data consumer role, you add a rule, which denies whenever there is, PI sensitive data, you actually deny access to it. Okay, so those are the scenarios that I wanted to go over. Now, moving on to some pending work, right, that is remaining. Access control only denies or allows access to a resource, that is, the details that you're seeing in the OpenMetadata data asset details page. But even though a user does not have access to certain data, they still appear in search results. They are still available in Explore. They're also available in Lineage. Filtering this is an extremely challenging work. Turning policies into search filters, this is something that we are going to be working on. Also, we will add additional policy functions so that you can write rich policy expressions. The permission checker UI. Right now, I was demoing all of these things by running an API call to show you what permissions a user has on a resource. We would like to add that into UI so that as an administrator, now you can debug your policy related problems by going to this permission checker UI, where you can say, this is the user, this is the resource, and what permissions does a user have, right? And this further extends to, you can say, check all the permissions of a user across all the resources. You can check the permission for a user for a resource type. And then you can also check, as I said before, permission for a specific table or a specific dashboard for a user. All of these are going to be possible in that permission checker UI to help you debug how policies are interacting and why somebody is not getting access or getting access denied, or getting access when it should not be getting. All of these things you should be able to debug. Today, admin is a flag under user. We would like to turn this into admin roles, which will give us an opportunity to now come up with team admin concept, right? So you can have team admins. There is organizational admin. He can he can set some users as team admins, and now they can do all the administrative operations within a team. Also, more comprehensive documentation with use cases, because there are a lot of questions. You should be able to find this documentation and solve the problems by yourself will be added. So these are all some of the pending work. Thank you for attending the webinar. If you have any questions, we can go over them at this point in time.
Carly is asking, how does the deny policy being discussed apply to users in other teams?
Yeah, so the way we do that is when we apply policies, right? The team policies are applied to the resources that are owned by the team. So in this case, what happens is, if there is a team policy, right, that doesn't say in this case, right, it is not allowing the access to the data. If it has PI tag, it allows only for the owners. So the way this applies is when we compile the policies, right, we take not only the policies and roles that apply to the user. We also take the policies that apply to a resource because of a team ownership, right? So in our case, the customer complaints belongs to customer experience, right? Now, when you try to access customer complaints, because there are policies that are denying access, right? When there is PII tag, that policy, because customer complaints as a resource belongs to customer experience, the policy from customer experience gets applied for this resource.
We have a couple of other questions in the chat.
Let
One
me...
is, besides tables, can we restrict access to insights?
Yeah, so now data insights itself is not a, data insight, creating a data insight and operations related to data insights is a separate entity, right? So you can have access control for, those resources, right? For adding data insights and things like that. Now, data insight information itself is actually something that is then, attached to a table, right? So if we have data insights for, let's say, dashboards in the future, it will be an additional metadata created for the dashboard. So the access control for that would be, based on those operations for, those kind of entities. Teddy, do you want to jump in? Is data insight information is attached to a table, or, is it a separate entity where, you can control access to that?
Yeah, data insight charts are a separate entity. So you'll be able to, you should be able to control the view, access to restrict view of those data insights.
Yeah. So, yeah. So in this case, what you do is, you build a rule, and the resource is data insight, and then data insight itself will have a set of operation. Now you can allow or deny it.
Yeah, if we can restrict the access to databases or specific data services.
Yeah, so in case of the specific data, okay, so what we don't have today is attaching a policy to a resource. So the way, the policies for a resource, function is that resource should belong to a team, right? So there should be an ownership. Through the team ownership, you inherit the team policy. So in this case, you can have database service that belongs to a team, and the team has a policy, or a database belongs to a team, and then team has a policy, and those policies will come into effect.
Next question here is, can we restrict access to services based on the teams who own it?
Yeah, so that is exactly what I was explaining. If a service is owned by a team has a policy, the resource will inherit based on the ownership, the policies from the team, and you can restrict the, you can perform access control based on that.
Here another question that we have is visibility of tables in lineage graphs affected by the policies? So if a user is denied by a rule, then the table does not show in the lineage.
Okay, so answer to that question is, right now, access control will, if you go to a specific data asset page, it will allow or deny access, right? Now, turning this access control policies into a couple of things, right? So for example, you search, right? Or you explore the data. Turning this access control into a search filter is a very challenging problem, right? So we don't have that functionality yet. So that means, let's say if you hide the data from a specific team or a user, they cannot actually click that data asset and look at the data asset details, right? However, in the explore and search, this data assets still appear, right? So we are working on turning this access control policies into search filters. That hasn't happened yet. The second thing is similarly, right? These data assets that are hidden from a user might be available in lineage. In other places where we are showing the relationship, that filtering, is also not happening, right? So what currently happens is that data becomes visible for you through search, and when you click the data, you don't get access to it.
So this one says, based on role, would it be possible to hide some UI components? And the idea is to reduce the information explosion to a user. For example, not want to see data insights, not want to see settings, the user page, etc.
To answer that question, we use permissions API today, right, from the UI to disable certain operations, right? For example, if you cannot edit description, then the UI will disable editing description or adding tags. All of those operations are automatically disabled by the UI. Now, coming to the question, can we disable certain pieces of the UI? This depends on specific use cases. If you have any use case in mind, get back to us and we'll take a look at what we can do there. And then the second thing is we are also assuming that this is coming from, there's all this information presented to every persona. We have plans of adding support for personas where, maybe data engineers want to look at certain things differently from maybe data scientists or maybe regular data consumers. So there will be some level of personalization that, we will build based on personas to do that. Was that the reason why you wanted to customize the UI based on permissions?
Yes, it was the reason. Thank you.
One
Any other
question.
questions?
In the case, in the case of the insights, in this example that you were mentioning, could it be possible to hide the insights section?
So today we don't do permission checking for data insights to hide the page, but if that is a requirement, we can definitely do that.
Thanks. Perfect.
Where data insights will be disabled.
We're interested in that as well too.
You guys don't want to show data insights to the users?
Only the power users.
I see. Yeah, so the way it would work today is, you don't have permissions for data insights and it will be disabled for you.
Maybe a follow-up question that we can discuss now. I am just curious why people want to hide so many things.
Yeah, no, I'm very surprised. I actually think that all this information should be available for everybody. That is the approach we took in Uber when we built similar things, right? We want more information to be available to the users. Of course, right, there are always some tables that you don't want anybody to see, right? You want to hide certain sensitive data like that it exists, right, for some users. But rest of the information, the approach we took was it freely, flows. People can discover, people can understand, how an organization is doing, right? So, and then crowdsource based on that understanding more metadata, right? In terms of user knowledge. So that is how collaboration happens, right? So, but I don't know if anybody, wants to hide this can, talk about why they want to hide.
Oh yeah, I agree. It's that's definitely a good use case. It's just we're working in a pretty secure government environment with government customers, and so they really want to. So we want to get away from the silos because that's counterproductive. But then at the same time, there's definitely a lot of need to know rules and policies that we need to make sure that we're enforcing in the tool. But at the same time, the people that there will be people that have a broader view that will use the tagging to kind of control access to different pieces of information for certain organizations. So that's kind of our use case. It's a little bit different, but that collaboration you just described will happen on almost like an organizational level within the enterprise. It's just, it has to be firewalled off to certain other organizations just because of need to know and data privacy concerns and things like that, classifications.
Makes sense. So we are 12 minutes over. For all the people attended, thank you for attending the webinar.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, folks. And thank you, Suresh.
Thank you.